Thank you for inviting me. I only wish that current circumstances would allow me to be in Trento, where I remember spending a splendid holiday in 1999, but there we are. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, say something about the Royal Institution, because people outside Britain may not be too familiar with it. Say something about the audience for the Royal Institution, something about the Christmas lectures, then a sort of slightly detailed account of Faraday's chemical history with candle lectures, and then wrap up with a sort of brief overview of the lectures in the 20th and early 21st century. Well, this is the Royal Institution building on Oldmar Street, which is just off Piccadilly, in Mayfair, which is one of the wealthiest districts in London. It was originally a townhouse, which the RI, when it was founded in 1799, purchased, and the columns were added in the late 1830s at Faraday's suggestion in order to show that something different happened in this building from the hotels, clubs, publishers, restaurants that occupied other buildings in the street. The founders, the main founders, there are a lot of founders, but the sort of chief protagonists, I suppose, in getting the RI underway was Sir Joseph Banks, President of the Royal Society of London, Sir Thomas Bernard, who was a major philanthropist in London, and Reichsgraf von Rumford, who, despite his German title, was actually an American adventurer and is quite an interesting character in many ways. And each of these individuals had different sorts of agendas for the RI. Rumford wanted to turn it into some sort of mechanics school. Bernard pressed for having a major lecturing program, and it was his agenda that won out in the end. And an enormous lecture theatre was built in that building. The contract drawing is on the left, and a photograph of the theatre in the 1890s is on the bottom right. That room had to be demolished for health and safety reasons in the 1930s. So the theatre, although follows the same sort of pattern as the original theatre, is actually really rather different space. And this theatre at times during the 19th century could hold more than 1,000 people, which must have been very, very crowded indeed, and would have broken all COVID regulations had they then existed. The person who really established the Royal Institution's reputation for lecturing and indeed for research, so that was never intended as a major occupation of the RI, Humphrey Davy, seen here as a very young man in Bristol. Davy came from Cornwall, spent 2.5 years at the Medical Pneumatic Institution in Bristol, where he discovered things like the physiological properties of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and in the spring of 1801 was appointed lecturer and then professor in chemistry. And this is James Gilway's famous cartoon showing the first professor of chemistry, Thomas Garnett, administering nitrous oxide to Sir John Hippisley, the treasurer of the Royal Institution, with Davy holding a pair of bellows waiting for further action. Now, one of the unusual things, in fact, probably unique things about the Royal Institution was that right from the beginning, it admitted women to its lectures. And you can see quite a few women in this space. And the other thing, which isn't so evident from this illustration, is that quite young people were in lectures. We know, for example, that Eleanor Ann Pordon, quite a significant romantic poetess, attended lectures with her father when she was a teenager. And I think we can be fairly certain that William Godwin's daughter, later Mary Shelley, authoress of the Frankenstein story, also attended Davy's lectures. We do know for certain that the figure of Dr. Veltman in the Frankenstein story is modeled very, very precisely on Humphrey Davy, and it would be almost inconceivable that she could have done that without having met and seen Davy in action. And Davy was part of Godwin's circle right from the beginning when he was in London, and as evidenced by this letter from Coleridge to Robert Southey at the end of 1799, referring to the cadaverous silence of Godwin's children, and thinking of Mary Wollstonecraft, and Coleridge was oppressed by it the day he and Davy dined at Godwin's. Davy turned the Royal Institution into the most popular venue for scientific lectures in the first decade of the 19th century, and became, as a result, really very famous. Attracted huge audiences. Some estimates put it about 50% of the audiences were women, and one of the members of the audience was a very wealthy widow, Jane Priest. This is not a picture of Jane Priest. I'm still looking for a picture of her. This is just a silhouette as a stand-in. She attended Davy's lectures. They met socially, courted, and married in 1812, and lived happily ever afterwards. Her fortune came from her father, who was a merchant on the British West Indian colony of Antigua, and we all know what that would mean. She had an income of £4,000 a year and a capital of £60,000 a year, and on the basis of that, Davy was able to retire from all his paid positions. Now, Davy had two successors at the Royal Institution following him. The first is William Thomas Brand, who was a perfectly good chemist and lecturer, but not particularly charismatic, certainly not as charismatic as Davy was. And Michael Faraday, who was both charismatic and an excellent, a premier researcher. He joined the RI at the age of 21 as a lecture and laboratory assistant in the sort of early part of the 1810s, and in the mid-1820s was promoted to be superintendent of the house, that is a sort of chief executive role, and director of the laboratory, and then a few years later he was appointed Fullerian Professor of Chemistry. The appointment of Faraday to being director of the laboratory and superintendent of the house in the mid-1820s is enormously significant, because that coincided with a major financial crisis when banks were failing, money was very, very tight in London, and the RI's finances were in not particularly good shape, though nothing's changed since then, as to say. And so Faraday, as effectively the person in charge, decided to do something about this, and he did two things. First was to found the Friday evening discourses for members, a series that continues to this day. And the second thing he decided to do was to establish explicit lectures for young people, juveniles, as they were termed in the language of the day. And Faraday, I think what Faraday was doing here was codifying what was already in existence. As I mentioned earlier, Eleanor Porden clearly attended lectures as a teenager. We're fairly certain that Mary Wollstonecraft, before she married Shelley, attended lectures. And so what Faraday was doing was taking that part of the audience, that juvenile part of the audience, and formalizing it at a time of the year where children would be, or juveniles would be, able to attend lectures as a whole, and that is sort of around Christmas. This is at the same sort of time that Christmas was being constructed in English society as a major festival, a major winter break. Within a few years after all the Christmas Carol and Pickwick papers were being published, which extol a sort of form of Christmas that really didn't exist in the sort of late 17th and much of the 18th century. The first lecturer was John Millington, who is a really interesting character. He was Professor of Mechanics at the Royal Institution, but later went to South America to work in the silver mines in South America and in Mexico, and wound up as professor at William and Mary College in Virginia. And this is his tomb in Richmond, Virginia. There is a portrait of him apparently, but I've not been able to pin it down. And although Faraday's role in establishing lectures isn't completely documented, it is interesting that it's not until the third series of 1827-28 that Faraday gives his first course of lectures. But thereafter, Faraday gives a further 18 courses of Christmas lectures. At this time, the lectures there was a course of lectures for 6 lectures. Each lecture nominally lasted an hour. There is quite a lot of evidence that that time was extended. And you can see that Faraday does repeat his lecture courses over sort of 10-year cycle or so. I mean, if you're a chemist and a natural philosopher, there's only a sort of limited number of things you can say to engage the interests of young people. These lectures of Faraday became enormously famous. So, for example, Alexander Blakely painted Faraday giving the course in 1855-6 in front of the Prince Consort, the Prince of Wales sitting on the Prince Consort's right, future Edward VII, and Prince Alfred not paying as much attention as one would hope. And that was published in Illustrated London News as a print. And later on, again, the Illustrated London News, a sort of prominent weekly publication, commented on the power of Faraday's lecturing, Faraday's communication of science. For the last 8 seasons, Professor Faraday has undertaken this task with a modesty and a power which it is impossible to praise too much. There can be no greater treat for anyone fond of scientific pursuits than to attend a course of these lectures. Now, from the end of the 1850s, Faraday was trying desperately to retire from all his positions at the Royal Institution and indeed elsewhere. But because he was arguably one of the most famous natural philosopher chemist certainly in England and arguably in Europe at that time, everybody was very, very reluctant to let Faraday formally go. And so he was retained, but with diminishing duties. So when the Christmas lecture season of 1860-61 came round, Faraday thought he had escaped giving the lectures, as is indicated by his wife's comment to a nephew, that it was thought not good for your uncle to give up anything he could keep at the same time. So it's not Faraday thinking he can not give the lectures, it's somebody else thinking Faraday should give the lectures. And so Faraday was inveigled into giving his final set of Christmas lectures in 1860-61 on the chemical history of a candle. Now, like all good lecturers, and as I indicated earlier, Faraday reused his notes and effectively gave the same course of lectures. There's some indication in the manuscript that the sort of content changed slightly, but the structure remained overall the same. So the chemical history of candle first had its outing in the 1848-49 season. Notebook came out again in the 1854-5 season. Notice the title has changed, but the lectures are exactly the same. And then in 1860-61, it returns to the original title, Chemical History of a Candle. And Faraday's notebook still exists in the archives, and as one can see, it's probably been a bit too close to a candle at times. In these lectures, Faraday believed in demonstrating spectacular experiments with as much noise and explosion and color and light that he could maintain, because he's talking to children. He's got to engage the interests of children, and there's nothing like bangs and flashes to do that, and that is still what happens in lectures at the Royal Institution to this day. So, for example, instead of sort of normal way of detecting the presence of water, he throws potassium, which Davy had discovered, onto water to show that water is in the jar where the potassium has landed. There are easier ways, less spectacular ways of demonstrating the presence of water, but this is a very engaging way of doing so. He performs experiments with the miner's safety lamp, again invented by, well, actually both by him and Davy at the end of 1815. And on the right is his philosophical candle, where you have zinc in a mixture of acid producing hydrogen, which you then light to create a candle. Again, there are easy ways of creating a candle, but not so spectacular. And another experiment he does is to evacuate a couple of Magdeburg spheres and try and get the children to pull them apart. They should probably not have been able to do, but we have not found any sort of record of anybody attending these lectures to sort of see how the experiments went. And so you gathered from these sort of 3 or 4 experiments and demonstrations that Faraday undertook that chemistry and candles are being interpreted extremely widely, and that is continued in what's phrased as well a long quotation, where Faraday talks about what he calls the emission of carbonic acid, what we call carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. A man in 24 hours converts as much as 7 ounces of carbon into carbonic acid, that is carbon dioxide. A milch cow will convert 70 ounces and a horse 79 ounces solely by the act of respiration. That is, the horse in 24 hours burns 79 ounces of charcoal or carbon in his organs of respiration to provide his natural warmth in that time. And what an extraordinary notion this gives us of the alterations going on in our atmosphere. As much as 5 million pounds or 548 tons of carbonic acid is formed by respiration in London alone in 24 hours. And where does all this go? Up into the air. Again, a really, really topical theme. And I would sort of really like to know whether Faraday, working with his new young colleague, John Tyndall, who discovered the principle of the greenhouse effect, shortly after this period, talked to Faraday about the impact of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere. And Faraday makes it quite clear that he is using the candle as a really simple device in which to explore the universe as a whole. He makes it quite clear about the role of a candle. There is not a law under which any part of this universe is governed which does not come into play and is touched upon in these phenomena of a candle. Faraday's lectures, as illustrated by newspaper reports, by the accounts in Illustrated London News, and so on, made publishers try to persuade Faraday to put them into print. And as late as 1859, Faraday was refusing to publish his lectures, and he writes to a publisher at the beginning of January, beginning of 1859. He was proposed to take them, that's the lectures, by shorthand, and so save me trouble. But I knew that would be a thorough failure. Even if I cared to give time to revision of the manuscript, still the lectures about the experiments and the vivacity of speaking would fall far behind those in the lecture room as to effect. But within a few months, Faraday had changed his mind and had agreed to publication of his lectures. So Faraday, who fairly seldom changed his mind on issues like this, one has to wonder why. And I think the answer to that question is to be found in Faraday's critique of spiritualism, of table turning, that from the early 1850s, right the way through the decade and into the 1860s and 70s, exercised profound attractions on what Faraday otherwise regarded as an educated middle-class audience. In rooms throughout London and beyond, tables turned of their own volition. You read quite extraordinary stories of tables flying out of the Prussian embassy in Carlton House Terrace and flying back in again. And Faraday was frequently asked, well, what's the cause of this? Is it scientific? Is it a spiritual phenomenon? And Faraday, this offended not only Faraday's scientific sensibilities, but also his religious sensibilities. Previously, Faraday had ignored this kind of what would have been called, what could be called pseudoscience. So that the term did exist, but it wasn't actually widely used at this period. But when both his scientific and religious beliefs were affected, Faraday felt called to respond. And in 1854-55, he launched massive counterattacks on the delusions, that's the word he used, of the table turners, of the spiritualists. He devised his indicator, which, when the indicator wasn't present on a table, the table would turn. When the indicator was present, people watching the indicator, the table wouldn't turn. And this heaped more criticism on Faraday from table turners. And I think what Faraday felt was that he just couldn't sort of sit there and say, well, this is nonsense, and here's the evidence for it being nonsense. He had to sort of show somehow that scientific rationality in support of a theistic view of the world was an entirely plausible thing to do. And the key figure here was a very young journalist, William Crooks, who actually, ironically, by the 1870s had become a major spiritualist himself, but Faraday was safely dead by that point, so he didn't know about that. And he persuaded Faraday, first of all, to publish his penultimate series of Christmas lectures on various sources, various forces of matter. And then the following year, got him to agree to publish his lectures on the chemical history of candle. First of all, this was published in the weekly chemical journal that Crooks edited, called Chemical News. And one does have to say that Crooks does seem to have been short of copy for a lot of the early issues of the Chemical News. So filling up a quarter of an issue with Faraday's lectures was a very good way of making sure you produce a decent sized issue each week. And likewise, it cost the Atlantic Ocean and Scientific American published the lectures also in its weekly edition, despite the raging of the American Civil War at the time. These were collected up and published by Crooks, edited by Crooks, as a course of 6 lectures on the chemical history of a candle, and published in 1861 for the first time. It has never been out of print since then, in English at any rate. And I have to say, I was responsible for yet another English edition when I published in 2011, the edition to mark the 150th anniversary of the first publication of Chemical History of a Candle. It's been translated into numerous languages, Japanese on the left, Portuguese on the right. I was an advisor on the Japanese edition, so I know what my name looks like in Japanese characters, not that it helps me too much. And in total, so far, I've identified publications in these languages. I'm afraid to say I have never been able to lay my hands on an Italian edition of the candle, but I'm sure the library at Trento should have one if you want to go and sort of read it in Italian. Not only has it been widely publish continuously in English, frequently in many other languages. In the seminal text on science communication, science in public, written by Jane Gregory and Steve Miller, quite a few years ago now, they spent an entire chapter using Faraday's chemical history of the candle as the exemplar of good scientific communication. Quite what this edition was doing with a picture of Einstein on the front, I've got no idea. It'd be much better to have Faraday on the front, but I might be still slightly biased. Since Faraday's time, the Christmas lectures have continued every year, apart from 1941 to 1943, for obvious reasons. And this gives you some idea of the sorts of topics that have been covered by the lectures over nearly 2 centuries now. And one can see the sort of physical sciences dominate, and that's really because the professors, the members of staff at the Royal Institution tended to be on that side of things. And one can see that again reflected in the number of lecture series given by Faraday's successors or colleagues. So Bragg gave 7 series, Faraday's young successor, John Tyndall, gave 12 series, James Dewar 9. That's in the 19th century. Moving to the 20th century, one can begin to see the strain of giving multiple courses of 6 lectures was beginning to tell. All sorts of issues were still coming to the fore. So William Henry Bragg, who was director from 1923 until his death in 1942, gave 4 series, and his son only 2 series. And that's an example of Lawrence Bragg giving the Christmas lectures in 1961. And you can see on the lecture bench huge amounts of apparatus. The thing, it's always the engagement showing science. I mean, Bragg actually said on one occasion to Bill Coates, who's the lecture assistant operating Wimson's machine in the center of the image, don't talk about science, show it. And that's precisely what Bragg and most other lecturers do. Now, since 1945, only 3 people have delivered the Christmas lectures more than once, twice in each case. Eric Laithwaite, an engineer, George Porter, who was director in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, photochemist, and Charles Taylor, who worked on the physics of music and indeed helped design Cardiff Opera House on sound acoustical principles. The real problem in giving Christmas lectures in the post-1945 period was the arrival of television. You can see here, this is Eric Laithwaite giving one of his lectures. And the arrival of television, and there had been sort of attempts to film the lectures going back to the 1930s, but it's not until the mid-60s when BBC Two, which was a sort of minority channel, the third television channel to be opened in Britain. It wasn't until then that the Christmas lectures started being broadcast continuously on television, as they still continue to this day. But by having television cameras in, you completely change the dynamic of a live lecture, because in lectures things go wrong, and in television things are not supposed to go wrong. And so you had this tension between the lecturer who wanted to still continue his or her narrative for a significant period of time. Something goes wrong and the director comes in and says, cut, we've got to sort of repeat it. And so that sort of tension is there, it has remained, and it's not going to go away anytime ever, I would suspect. Eric Laithwaite was also one of the most controversial of post-war lecturers, Christmas lecturers, because he argued in one of his course of lectures that the laws of thermodynamics were incorrect, that conservation of energy could be violated, which caused enormous amount of controversy, particularly as it's being broadcast to children. And as a result, he became virtually a non-person so far as the scientific community was concerned. But he was one of the earliest performers lecturing on science and engineering, because he's an electrical engineer by background, to the Royal Institution. In fact, if one thinks communicating science is difficult, communicating engineering is even more difficult. And Layfitt was actually one of the few people I've ever come across who could communicate engineering in an accessible way. So with Faraday's fame, with the regular annual broadcasting of lectures on British television, and now on the web, easily accessible on the web, perhaps the supreme accolade for the Christmas lectures came in 1991, which is the bicentenary of Faraday's birth, which not only contained a portrait of Faraday on the new £20 note issued by the Bank of England, but also depicted Faraday's lecture as painted by Blakely, giving a Christmas lecture. Bank of England notes are really important, is a really important medium for getting messages across. So for example, recently, enormous interest in whether Rosalind Franklin or Alan Turing should appear on the new £50 banknote. Not that many people will see the £50 banknote, that is, but still enormous interest about who would appear on the note. Alan Turing won, by the way, and this is Faraday winning his place in banknote history with his Christmas lecture at the Royal Institution. Thank you.